Amen. All right, well, we got our readers. As you can see, we're going to be talking about Rule of Law Part Dos. And let's talk about it. Let's see, if you have any questions about the quiz, last week's quiz or anything like that, go ahead and email me, because again, remember, there's always people who may not have taken it yet and are running a little bit behind. So just to be fair to everybody, not to give away answers. So you can always email me on that if you have questions. For next week, is two things to read actually before taking your quiz. That's Chapter 3 and Appendix E. Hey, I was a poet and you didn't know it. Yeah, Chapter 3 and Appendix E. I know you want to say stop rhyming and I mean it. Didn't we already talk about that? Anybody want a peanut? Anyway, so please answer the open book questions in the assignment. You were just typing. Oh, one of the greatest movies of all time, right? If you don't know what we're talking about, Princess Bride, amazing. All right. So open book quiz in the assignment tab, and of course before your deadline 1 week from today. You do have some more constitutional reading, little chunks to read. There's another reading, can the war for independence be justified biblically? Answer those questions, although these you don't have to submit. Your parents were going to name you Wesley after the movie, if you were a boy. Oh my. I guess somebody really likes that movie and that family, huh? And then Bible, continue memorizing Romans 13, 1, 2, and 4. At least you weren't Buttercup. Oh, that would be awful, wouldn't it? I think I would just go by BC for Buttercup. Although BC, that wouldn't be too bad. Yeah, a lot of great lines from that movie, especially about the, the Sicilian trying to outwit, what was that line? Never... It wasn't never mess with a Sicilian. Never something with a Sicilian. I'm drawing a blank. Never go against a Sicilian. Of course, it's the way he says it, right? Never go against a Sicilian when death is on the line. Yeah, the lisp is what totally does it. And then he just keels over. Great movie. All right, so any questions about the homework? Then we'll have to leave Princess Bride behind, sadly. I'll have to work it somehow into our lesson one of these days. Anyway, here's what we're going to do today. We're going to be revisiting the biblical foundations of government. We're going to be reviewing that. And by the way, I should say this is part 2 in our study of the rule of law. So in doing that, we're going to look at the biblical foundations of government again. We're going to go back to the beginning of our nation, time machine style, right? And we're going to ask, was the war for independence justified, at least according to the Bible? And number 3, we're going to revisit the laws of nature and of nature's God. And in looking at God's laws, especially for nations, we're going to be looking at the following questions. Do the civil laws given to Israel apply in principle to nations outside of Israel? And then the second question we'll look at is, are God's civil laws too harsh? Because a lot of people treat them that way, so we're going to take that question square on. Now, last week, we looked at Deuteronomy 17, verse 19. And you see the first bullet there. When he, that's the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, and he is to read it all the days of his life. So we saw from that the king in Israel was under authority. He was under God's authority, and he was required to read the law. You've also been reading and memorizing Romans 13, right? Romans 13 there. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Now, hopefully you get what Romans 13 is saying here. I mean, we are supposed to obey the civil authorities. So here's a question for you. That being the case, since we're supposed to obey the civil authorities, was it right for the colonists to break from Great Britain? I mean, how is that being subject to the governing authorities? What do you think about that? What do you think? Was it right for them to do that? I mean, this is an important question. Doesn't our July 4th depend on the answer to this question, whether we're going to celebrate it or not? I mean, I would be willing to bet in this classroom, some of you, like our family here, have never celebrated Halloween because of what it stands for. Now, look, if you have, not heaping condemnation, I know some Christian families that do. I know a lot who don't, and we don't. And the big reason, the underlying reason, is because of what Halloween stands for, right? So, if you're not going to celebrate Halloween because of what it stands for, are you going to celebrate July 4th when they may have been not submitting to if this was like a whole rebellious act? We have to take into account that the king was a tyrant, Ben says. Christina says the government was not following God. Okay, well, those are some good thoughts, good comments. We're going to jump in and analyze all of this. But basically, we've got a couple questions here that I think we need to keep in mind. First of all, was it right for the colonists to break from Great Britain? Okay, we're going to talk about that. Secondly, must citizens obey any and every decree that comes from the lips of a government official? I've thrown that question in because I think that plays into this as well, at least discerning the answer to that question. Now, let me just warn you, there's several issues here, and we're going to be looking at these in several parts over the next 3 weeks. So fair warning, this might get a little bit frustrating because you might have questions that come up that we're not going to fully resolve until a couple weeks from now, as we just sort of slowly unpack this, okay? Some questions we'll take head on today. Others may be, I might punt and put off till next week, and you already said so. Well, hopefully we'll be able to deal with a lot of them today, Hannah. But some might not get fully resolved until 2 weeks from now, because what I'm going to be doing is really just sort of building a case here, precept upon precept, as it were. So let's start off with this question. Is there a biblical case for certain types of civil disobedience? Now, when I say civil disobedience, I mean individuals, citizens, people in a country disobeying the government. Okay, that's civil disobedience. Is there a biblical case for that? I mean, despite everything we've just read, from Deuteronomy and Romans 13, is there a case that can be made? Adrian says yes, if it is in conflict with the Bible. Okay, can you give me, that certainly sounds good. Now give me examples of that. Because we could just say, it's against the Bible, or, the Bible says, but then, we need to give specific examples. Balaam. How did Balaam disobey the civil authorities? I think, and maybe you're thinking of it in a unique way, but I'm thinking he was more, well, it wasn't his king. It was the king of another country. Which makes him all the more a traitor, if anything. He was wanting to sell out for the money. The underground church gathering despite opposition. Adrian, good example, but it's not a biblical example. So we want to first establish that God says it's okay, and then underground church would be a good example of that. David ate sacred food from the temple. You are right. He disobeyed, well, although Jesus later said what he did was okay, was that an example of civil disobedience? Um, Boy, that's an interesting one. I mean, it was certainly a case of not following the law on the one hand, but Jesus said it was okay, just like quote unquote breaking the Sabbath is okay when you rescue an ox that's fallen into a ditch on the Sabbath. Now, okay, the apostles told not to speak in Jesus' name, but they continue. Now, that's certainly a clear example of disobeying the human authorities. The only thing I'm a little with the David example is that it wasn't so much disobeying human authority. It was more of where you had different principles in conflict, and Jesus says you go with mercy when there's different principles in conflict, if that makes sense. But Christina's example of, humans telling the apostles, don't preach in Jesus' name, and they say, well, we've got to obey God rather than man. Okay, that is a clear example of civil disobedience. Good, so that's one. Can you give me others? Or is that the only example in the Bible? Boy, because if that's the only example, then I might say, well, were the people doing it civil authorities? They were more religious authorities. Yeah. So maybe that's not if that's your only example, I don't know. So can you give me any examples of people disobeying civil government and it's okay? Aha! Daniel praying to God when it was against the law. Very good. Oh yeah, Moses' mother letting him live. Not only was Moses' mother justified in doing what she did, so were the Hebrew midwives for not killing the children. The Bible says God blessed them for their obedience, for not killing the children. So yeah, so now we're starting to get several examples of people disobeying civil government and God saying it's okay. Okay, Hannah's got a question. You can go ahead and type that. Any other examples? Because there's more. Oh, yes, there's more. In fact, back in Daniel, how about Rack, Shack, and Benny? I mean, you've seen the Veggie Tales, right? Dun, 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 dun. It's a hard song to sing. Na 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 dun 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 dun. So yeah, you've got the Rack Shack, and I'm way out of tune. I know. Well, like I said, it's a hard song to sing. Any other examples? What about? Well, here, let's go to the next slide so you can fill some things in. How about Rahab? Right? I mean, she disobeyed her civil authorities. Three wise men not returning to the king's court. That's an interesting one. You could maybe, I mean, if that was your only example, I would say, yeah. I mean, it wasn't their king. It wasn't like the king demanded it. He asked. So, it's maybe not the best example, but sure, we can throw it into the mix. Hannah says, I thought the midwives said they would kill the children, but they didn't. Of course, it would be wrong to kill the children. Well, to clear the confusion, Hannah, reread the passage and just keep in mind that the midwives were lying to the Pharaoh. Basically, the Pharaoh says, why haven't you obeyed me? And he says, and they say, oh, Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're strong, and they give birth so quickly that when we get there, they've squirreled the children away. They've hidden the children away, and which would be really remarkable that in every single case, if the midwives were really trying to get there quickly and kill the children, that they were always too late. See, they were lying to the king, to the Pharaoh, and God says he blessed them and gave them their own children because of their obedience. Queen Vashti. Yeah, that might be considered civil disobedience, although I don't know that that's your best example, because it's not like she was, See, in all the examples we've just given, people disobeyed because they were obeying God. I don't know that Vashti was obeying God by refusing to show up. Esther entering the court. Yeah, now that's a good example. In fact, I'd never even thought of that one, but absolutely, Esther entering the court, because she was doing it to save life, and yet she was obviously disobeying, what the rules that existed, which was you had to be called into the court. Good example. A for the day, thinking of one that the teacher has never thought of in all his years of teaching. Very nice. Good job, Christina. All right, so we've established that all these examples, these people were blessed. The scriptures praise them for doing what they did, for disobeying civil authorities. But then, what about Romans 13? I mean, doesn't Romans 13:2 clearly say, therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So how do we square this verse, this passage, with the disobedience by the saints in the Bible? Obviously, the Bible contradicts itself, right? I mean, just throw up your hands. That's the answer. Right? No, not right. How do you square Romans 13 with all those examples we just looked at? Anna says, Grace, it said Jesus obeyed the rules by performing miracles on the Sabbath. Yeah, that's right. He disobeyed human misinterpretation of the rules. And it says God's authority is still above them. If it's contrary to God's law, then we have to obey God rather than man. Okay, so that's a true principle. So how does that fit with Romans 13? I mean, do you see the dilemma there? I mean, on the surface, at first blush, first reading, it might seem like a contradiction. Ben says God is the ultimate authority, and when the fallible human authority is clearly not from God and contrary to his law, then we cannot obey both God and man. Hit it out of the park, Ben, like to the warning track. God is the ultimate authority, bingo, and when the fallible human, change the word authority there for power. Human power, okay, when humans are exercising power and not they've stepped outside of the authority that God has given them, and they're commanding things that would force people to disobey, then we can and must disobey the human powers. Now, if they're truly exercising authority, God doing what is right, then absolutely verse 2 applies. We should not resist the authority. I mean, when when the authorities say thou shalt not murder and somebody murders, well, they've resisted the authority. I mean, they've resisted God's authority. They've resisted the human authorities, the authorities that have authority from God. Okay, so yeah, that's all well and good, but when they step outside of that role, outside of that mantle, and they're exercising power, like you have to kill your baby if it's a male, okay, then we obey God rather than man. So now we know how to reconcile Romans 13 with the likes of Daniel and Rahab and others, because they were obeying God rather than man. Hopefully, does that make sense? Is everybody on track with that so far? Because there's a lot of confusion on this in the Christian community. So, I don't want to breeze by this too fast, because this is a really important principle. Okay? But let me ask you this. Is passive civil disobedience a private individual's only option? In other words, by passive disobedience, look at all the examples that we just went over. None of them were like charging the castle and using force against the government. They were all just kind of going their own way and disobeying. I'm not going to kill my child. I'm going to hide him. I'm not going to stop praying. I'm going to go pray. In other words, so everybody was passive. It's like, just leave me alone. I'm going to go obey God and disobey the government. Is that our only option, or is it ever justified to use force against civil government? Is it ever justified to use force against a tyrant? I've told you that there's been a lot of misunderstanding on Romans 13 in the Christian community. Some individuals have appealed to Romans 13 and claim that government officials should never be resisted, never, ever, ever, based on Romans 13. And again, it's true that if officials are truly acting within their God-given authority, then yes, they should be obeyed. So the question really amounts to this: is it justified to resist government officials when they're exercising power and not authority? That is it okay to forcefully resist tyrants who are oppressing the people? I mean, that's ultimately what we're dealing with in terms of the question about the Founding Fathers and July 4th that we celebrate, because they forcefully resisted. Now, the U.S. Declaration of Independence says that it is usually wise for individuals to endure government excess if possible. All right. Now, our first reader is Jenna, and I'm going to bring her on in a second. But in fact, I'll have Jenna read, and then Jenna, you and I can just discuss this briefly. So Jenna, I'll unmute your mic here in a second, but what I'd like you to do is just to read this for us, and then just summarize it real quick. In other words, put it in 21st century English. So Jenna, how are you doing? Jen, are you talking? Because I cannot hear you. Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, so it's not just me. All right, so we got some issues going on there. How about let's go to construction Ben. Ben's got construction going on outside the window. Jenna, we might come back to you for a later one. So maybe there's some switch you got to flip. Hey Ben, how's it going?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can. But I can't hear the construction. Did it stop temporarily?
Nope, I got a noise canceling microphone.
Oh. Well, that's no fun. Actually, that's pretty cool. All right. Great. So Ben, why don't you read this for us and then summarize it for us? So go ahead, take it away.
All right. Mankind are most disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, and to right themselves by abolishing the forms of government to which they are accustomed. I think means while the government is outside of its authority, but its false laws are still sufferable, then mankind is more likely to abide by those laws than to try and turn government back to proper course.
Okay. That's a great stab at it. I mean, yeah, these guys, their 18th century English is really tough to understand. And that's a pretty good summary. I mean, basically, it's usually wise for individuals to endure government excesses if possible. And that's what they're saying. We're more disposed to suffer than just, don't go off half-cocked just because some things are going on that you don't like, and some things that the government is doing wrong. Just don't go off half-cocked. Put up with it, endure it. Okay, now we'll finish the ... there in just a second. But before we go any further, I want to do a quick, doesn't count for a grade. This is just for fun, like Nacho Libre says, right? Nacho, we do this just for fun. But like last week, you have to wait to answer at the same time. I know sometimes you're in your room in your stretchy pants and you take these quizzes just for fun, Chacho. In your room, yes. Oh man, this is like a trip today through all the great movies of all time, right? Anyway, so here is the. I'm going to show you the quiz question, but again, don't answer yet because we're all going to answer together. But basically, this quiz is going to be based on the story of David. You know, with David, how he fled from King Saul, and when he had the opportunity to kill him, he didn't. He refused. So, here's the question, but don't answer yet. Does the life of David show it's wrong for an individual to use force against the king? Okay? Does the life and example of David show it's wrong for an individual to use force against the king? Because let's face it, twice he had the opportunity to kill him, twice he said no, when he was fleeing from Saul. Okay, so go ahead, select your answer. Yeah, either yes, now don't type it or don't hit enter yet, but yes, his life does show it's wrong for an individual to use force against the king, or no, it doesn't show that. And now count off to three. You do yes or no. Yes or no. That's a little bit clearer. So I'm going to count off here. Here we go. One, two, three. Hit enter. Let's see what you got. Interesting. We've got, I don't know if this has ever happened before. We have a totally bloodthirsty class where all of you have said, I mean, sometimes I've got like a 50-50 split down the middle. But every single one of you said no. I mean, all of you are like for taking up armed government, I say. I'm not going to give you my answer to this yet, but we'll get back to this in a second. First, I want to go back to the Declaration of Independence, which, let's see, for this one, why don't we have Taylor read this? So, Taylor, let's see, Taylor. There's Taylor. Hey, Taylor, how you doing?
Good.
How you doing? All right. So, Taylor, earlier we read that the Declaration of Independence is really wise for government access if possible, but then it says this. Why don't you take this away, read this for us, and then just explain to us what Jefferson and the other founders were trying to say. Go ahead.
But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Excuse me.
What does this mean?
So I think what this is saying is if for like a long period of time the government just stays corrupt in what they're doing or the laws they're enforcing, it is the citizens' responsibility to put in a new person into place.
Okay, good. That's right. Thank you so much. That's right. So, putting this all together then, and I appreciate that, Taylor. Our declaration is saying that it's best to put up with the abuses of power if the government or if the governing officials are not acting like tyrants. But when they do start acting like tyrants and they're becoming oppressive, then you throw off such government and set up a new government. Now, to be sure, deciding when it is appropriate to resist is not an easy question. And there have been many writers throughout the centuries that have tackled this very difficult topic. President John Adams said that the writings from the period of the Reformation were highly influential in America before the War for Independence. Now, you know what the writings from the period of the Reformation are, right? These are the days of John Calvin, Martin Luther. Okay, so these types of works were very influential in America before the War for Independence. I mean, They weren't staying up late at night watching things like Nacho Libre or Princess Bride or America's Got Talent, right? I mean, they were studying these things and they were really grounded in these writings. Well, one of the books that was widely known in English-speaking parts of the world was Lex Rex. Okay, let's see. I got one comment that it's hard to hear me. Is it hard for everybody to hear me? Much better now? No, not anymore. Okay, good. It was a little quiet better. Okay, thank you for that comment. Great. Yeah, let me know when stuff like that happens. So Lex Rex was a widely known book. Here's the author of Lex Rex, Samuel Rutherford. Yes, that is a guy. Ladies, how would you like to take him home to mom? Oh, don't you love his locks? They're just so gorgeous. Just run your fingers through those locks, right? Okay, he was a godly guy, though. So let's not hate on him too much. Anyway, Samuel Rutherford lays out 3 steps of resistance in Lex Rex. You've got appeal, flight, and armed resistance. All 3 steps were followed by our founding fathers, and all 3 steps were based on the life of David. So let's take a look at David's life. All right? So here you've got David. You know this story. I'm sure you remember it. You know, David was playing music for King Saul, probably doing a little bit of a ZZ Top or Van Halen, you know, just wailing on Harp Hero. But Saul was more of a classical music buff, and he didn't like that raging rock sound, so he picks up a spear and he hurls it at David. Okay, this may be the NIV version of the Bible, you know, the not inspired version. Anyway, so thankfully Saul misses and David runs out of there, right? Or the message, right? Yeah, the message, that's even worse. So here's what David does. First of all, he makes an appeal through Saul's son, Jonathan. He makes an appeal. That's step 1. And so Jonathan goes to his dad, and you know, Saul, and he says, "Hey, Dad, is everything okay between you and David?" I mean, David thinks you're angry at him. I mean, I'm sure he's like totally wrong about this, right, Dad? Well, Saul picks up a spear and hurls it at Jonathan. And so Jonathan kind of gets the point, pardon the pun. Yeah, I guess my dad still is mad, right? So with David hiding in the bushes, Jonathan goes out with a servant boy and uses a secret code to let David know what's going on, right? And, you know, you remember this story. Jonathan shoots an arrow into the air. It fell to earth. He knew not where. Okay, wait, that's actually a poem from American history, right? Well, I changed it slightly, but who wrote that? Does anybody know who wrote the shot an arrow into the air? That's a Longfellow poem. Did any of you have to memorize any Longfellow poems in your home school? I mean, 30 years ago, every school-aged child had to memorize that. I was subjected to that. I have not subjected my kids to that. And then it ends with, like, I think I sent a song into the air, and it's just like, oh my goodness. No, I have my kids memorize the Bible, like important stuff. not that. Anyway, so, you know, the whole thing is, if Jonathan tells the servant boy, keep running, the arrow is far beyond you, then that's the cue that David needs to keep running from Saul. So David flees. He takes some men and he runs to the desert. That's step 2. David flees. Okay? So those are the first 2 steps, regardless of the order that they occur in, you know, either appealing or flight. What's important is that both of these steps come before step 3. And step 3 is, well, step 3 in David's life is armed resistance. Armed resistance. But on 2 occasions, David and his armed men had opportunity to kill Saul, but they don't. So this takes us back to our earlier quiz. Do the examples in the life of David show it's wrong for an individual to use force against the king? Does anybody want to change their answer at this point? I mean, because twice David says no, can't do it. All of you said no. Again, I've never had a class like this, full of bloodthirsty individuals. All of you said no, David's life does not show that it's wrong for an individual to use force against the king. Hannah, I feel like my answer was wrong, Hannah says. Hannah, stick to your guns, so to speak, because Rutherford would have agreed with you and all the other no's. He would have agreed with the no's, and that's what he argued. But wait a minute, why? How can you go against those two examples? Right, he wouldn't do it because Saul was the Lord's anointed one. So Ben, why did you answer no? Well, here's the passage that Samuel Rutherford goes to argue that it's not always wrong. Not everyone is anointed. Well, but isn't the point that civil government is anointed? So maybe Ben got the right answer for the wrong reason. See, that's the whole point. God has authorized civil government. So if it's wrong always to raise your sword against Saul, then it's wrong always to raise your sword against anybody in government. Exactly, as Hannah said, because all authority is ordained by God. So I think we do have a late-breaking switcher, right, Ben? I mean, haven't we just based on your argument? I think you should have been a yes, right? You should have answered yes. You're not switching. Ben's like, no, I want to stand with Samuel Rutherford and his long locks of hair. Well, here's where Rutherford goes to. He goes to 1 Samuel 21:9. It's a time when David was fleeing from Saul. He visits the priests and he asks them if they have any weapons. And in 1 Samuel 21, we read this verse. The priest replied, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth and lying in a manger." Oh, wait, that's the wrong story. Sorry. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one. And David says, there is none like it. Give it to me. That always cracks me up. There is none like it. I mean, that's an understatement, right? I mean, obviously there was no sword like Goliath's. Can you imagine how big the sword of a giant would be? I mean, you wonder if David could really pick it up. Yeah, it would be huge. Yeah, I could just see. Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. It looks like I accidentally hit the mute. Yeah, I was saying obviously that there was no sword like Goliath. I mean, because just dragging that thing behind him would have been leaving a trail in the desert, right? I mean, that would have been lugging a huge hunk of steel. But why would you want a sword in the desert? I mean, why would David have wanted this? I mean, I think he tells the priest, I'm expecting mail. I need something sharp to open the mail with. To kill Saul. Right. Well, at least for protection, right? See, Samuel Rutherford focuses on this verse to show that David was prepared to defend himself. So David is armed with Goliath's sword, presumably for protection, but then David says it's wrong on 2 occasions for him to kill Saul when he easily could have. Why? Why was it wrong for David, if it's okay for him to have that sword and use it, presumably against Saul, why, when he had the chance twice, did he say it was wrong? Laughing at Bella's comment. Why? Anybody want to take a stab at this? What do you think? Did God specifically tell him not to? No. No, not specifically, although he did say that Saul was the Lord's anointed. Well, then why did he even take the sword in the first place? Well, this is the answer that Saul could not fight back. You're close, James. I wouldn't say you're in the ballpark. You're maybe in the parking lot next to the ballpark. And I have no idea. You're killing me. Saul couldn't defend himself. Oh, Nicholas, you are. I tell you what. I'll give you. I'll just rework your answer, but you've hit on the answer. You've hit on the point that Saul. Well, let me say you're 90% there. It wasn't so much that Saul couldn't defend himself. It was that in both situations, Saul was not attacking. That's the key. Saul had not put David into a position of needing to defend himself. And that's what Grace is saying, killing an unarmed, defenseless man. Yeah, the point was more that Saul was not attacking him. Because what was Saul doing in both occasions? By the way, Rutherford's answered, because Saul was the Lord's anointed. Okay, that's what David specifically said. And Rutherford, through the context of the story, says David's life was not immediately under attack. Well, why was David's life not immediately under attack? What was Saul doing? I'd be interested to know if you know what Saul was doing, because our Sunday school teachers usually tell us one of the instances. Yeah, Hannah got the sleeping part. One of the times he was sleeping. Yes, Taylor got the other one. The other time he's doing his business. Yeah, you always wonder if like people in the Bible really did that. Well, yeah, they did. And this was the other time. He was relieving himself, and Rutherford's point is that an enemy who is relieving himself or an enemy who is sleeping is not an enemy who is attacking you. Therefore, you do not have the right of self-defense at that moment. You know, if you go back in your notes to previous classes, you'll see this principle of self-defense from Exodus 22, verses 2 and 3, which clearly establish people have the right to kill in self-defense, but it's a limited right. Okay, I mean, yeah, you can even use weapons in the defense of life, but you cannot kill in order to just protect property. Okay, so it has to be defense of life, but defense of life means just that. It means killing when your life is in danger. Nothing more, nothing less. And so Rutherford points out David's life was not in danger. You know, it's interesting that even in the War for Independence, the colonists had this drilled into their thinking. Captain John Parker was the captain of the local militia, the Minutemen, and he is now famous for the words that he spoke at this battle at Lexington and Concord. Does anybody know what he said right before this battle? Is it even okay to go to war then? Well, Hannah, and that's what we are establishing is this principle of self-defense. It's been long articulated in the church via understanding the Bible that a defensive war is legitimate, and that really cuts to the heart of what Captain John Parker told his men right before the battle of the shot heard round the world at the Battle of Lexington. Does anybody know what he told his men, Captain John? Don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes. You're close, Ella. That one was right before the Battle of Bunker Hill because they were limited on ammunition. So it was basically wait till they get real close. Bunker Hill, although in recent years they've said actually it's the Battle of Breed's Hill, but commonly known as Battle of Bunker Hill. But here was what Captain John Parker said. Stand your ground, men, and then here's the key. Don't fire unless fired upon. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. You see, they didn't want to start a war. They wanted it to be a defensive war. Why? Because they were schooled in the writings of Samuel Rutherford. They were familiar with the story of King David. And in our founding documents, all of our founding fathers were consumed with this idea. They wanted to make sure their actions were just. They wanted to make sure they were fighting a defensive battle. Now, we're all familiar with the Declaration of Independence. What year was it signed? Give me the year for the Declaration. It was, I'll give you a hint, 1776. Good, very good. You cannot graduate government class not knowing that. But notice what they said. We therefore, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. I am changing the slides. If not, yeah, just go back, go out and come back in. So, notice, were they appealing to the United Nations, appealing to the supreme judge of the world? No. They were appealing to God, right? Now look at what the founders wrote 1 year earlier than this. But, notice here, they're appealing to God. They want to make sure that what they're doing is right. They're crossing their T's, dotting their I's. They want to make sure that they're doing everything by the book. And 1 year earlier, in 1775, in their last official appeal that they sent to the king, I want you to see that the early Americans went through the three-step process that Rutherford outlines in his book, that Rutherford bases on the life of David. First of all, step one from our history. Here in this document known as the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, our founders say, we have fled. This was one of the steps, flight. Our forefathers, inhabitants of the island of Great Britain, left their native land to seek on these shores a residence for civil and religious freedom. So they point out that we have fled. Step two, appeals. Remember, I said it doesn't matter which is the order of step one or step two, as long as it comes before step three. We, for 10 years, incessantly and ineffectually, have besieged the throne as supplicants. We have reasoned, we have remonstrated with Parliament in the most mild and decent language, but subsequent events have shown how vain was this hope of finding moderation in our enemies. You can just hear them saying how we have appealed and appealed and appealed. Okay, so they have fled, they have appealed, and now it's time for step three, use of force in self-defense. In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, and which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it for the protection of our property acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against the violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed and not before. So there you have it. 3 steps from the life of David. Samuel Rutherford would have been happy with them, right? You see, Rutherford shows that you can use defensive force against the government, even against the king. Notice how these steps track the points of Lex Rex. They track the life of David. And, their thinking was well in line and tracking Samuel Rutherford. Rutherford, by the way, again, was a Christian man. The founding fathers were by and large Christians, and they wanted to do things the right way. They wanted to base their country and their laws on the Bible, because they wanted to reestablish the rule of law. They wanted to reestablish the rule of law. That's why they appealed to the laws of nature and of nature's God. What were the laws of nature and of nature's God? Do you remember? What were they? They were the laws from the Bible. That's right. So they were reestablishing the rule of law with the Declaration of Independence. In fact, when signing the Declaration, Samuel Adams said something that was very significant. He's known, of course, as the father of the American Revolution. Hopefully you would have remembered that from the DVD. But he's known as the father of the Revolution because of his work in starting the committees of correspondence. These committees were like the internet of their day. They would write lots of articles. They helped unite the thinking of the people, to help people see that the king was a tyrant, to help people see that the king was acting out of accord with God's word. So anyway, when signing the Declaration of Independence, Samuel Adams makes a very significant statement about the rule of law. And this is what he says: "We have this day restored the sovereign, to whom all men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven, and from the rising to the setting of the sun, let his kingdom come." You see, Sam Adams was saying that the tyrants were off the throne, now recognizing back on the throne, establishing a new country where God's laws would be the ultimate law. And then they put together a constitution to be the highest man-made law, and they did a pretty good job with the Constitution. You know, as believers, it's helpful having a great document like the U.S. Constitution, but let me ask you this: is it the highest law that we live under? No, it's not, because God's law is supreme, right? I mean, that is what they refer to as the laws of nature and of nature's God. It's helpful to know this, because if man's laws ever make it illegal to resist the king, then it helps to know what God's word says. Does God's word say it's okay to resist the king even with force? Well, see, that's why we keep coming back to God's word and we look at the question, who's really in charge? Because we need to hear from God's perspective what the answer to these questions are. So let me ask you this, and this is a bit of a review. What scriptures would you go to support the idea that even the civil government is under God's laws? What scriptures would you go to support the idea that even the civil government is under God's laws? Let's just review some of the things that we've gone over. Romans 13, good. That's the passage you're memorizing. Y'all should be memorizing anyway. I'm glad somebody pointed that out. Romans 13. What else? What other scriptures? Exodus and Deuteronomy. Okay, there were passages in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Can you be more specific than that? Or be more Pacific, as little kids say? Is that Pacific or Atlantic? Yeah, I don't know. How about, be more specific, Bob. There we go. How many movies can we justifiably refer to in this movie, in this class? Already been 3. The Incredibles, Nacho Libre, and Princess Bride. 3 all-time favorites. How about Psalm 2? I love this passage for and this is a class 1. But Psalm 2 verses 10 to 12 says that the kings of the earth who are outside of Israel must serve the Lord. Okay, notice verse 10, you kings, you rulers of the earth. Verse 11, serve the Lord. Verse 12, kiss his son. Right? Okay, this is talking about the Son of God. Remember, we talked about this. Kiss the Son, or else you get a sunburn like Sodom and Gomorrah did, right? So kiss the Son. In other words, submit to the Son. What's the point here? The point here is that even civil officials outside of Israel, right, you rulers of the earth, even civil officials outside of Israel are under God's authority, are under God's laws. That's why we see passages like Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, like the rivers of water. He turns it wherever he wishes. If God didn't have authority over rulers outside of Israel, then he couldn't have done what he like what he did to Nebuchadnezzar, where he basically took away his mental capacities and turned him into like an animal mentally. Remember that story? You've got passages like Revelation 19:16. Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That's what the Apostle John says. So he is king over all the nations. So he's in authority over them. His law applies to them. Now, I want to give you one more passage. It's a passage that you are all familiar with, I am sure, but you've probably only thought about it in terms of witnessing, and that is the Great Commission. Matthew 28:18 through 20. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. All right? Now, let's break this down. Notice all the words, first of all authority in heaven and on earth. Jesus has all authority in the earth. So obviously that means if he has all authority in earth, that's more than just authority over the church. He has authority over civil government, right? Because he has all authority. And this is very key to understanding the Great Commission, and I think most people miss this. Because understand this, Jesus is sending his disciples and, people after his disciples. He is sending them into countries where witnessing is banned, where the gospel is banned, where the Bible is banned, where Christianity is banned. And yet Jesus is saying, I have all authority even over those governments where they've done that, and I'm sending you there. After all, he can do that because he's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But he is directly sending people into countries where they are going to be doing what? They're going to be breaking the civil law over them. He doesn't just say, go into the countries where it's legal to preach and what. No, I am sending you into all the earth, right? Because I have all authority in heaven and on earth. Have you ever noticed that the Great Commission is very political? Yeah, just like Paul and the apostles, right? Did you ever see that? How political this Great Commission is? Now, also look at the words, teaching them to obey. Jesus is not just telling his disciples to give people the gospel or show them how to have personal devotions and things like that. All that's important. But he says, teach them to obey all of my teachings. And that means everything. So, here's a question for you. Did Jesus say anything about civil government? Well, first of all, he just did, right? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, and I'm sending you into all the nations. Okay, that's a very political, civil government-ish statement that he's making. So, yeah, he did, but this wasn't the only time, First of all, notice that his followers are to disciple the nations and not just individuals. So right there, that has a political aspect to it too. But look at some of the other teachings on civil government. Here's a famous one. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. Very simply put, Caesar doesn't own everything. He doesn't have all authority. His authority is limited. Now, there is a proper role for civil government. They do have some authority, and we do owe some duty to them. Hence, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. But government's authority is limited. That's a very radical statement, but that's very in keeping with what the Founding Fathers believed. It's in keeping with the Constitution, and it's been in keeping with what we've been talking about for these last five class periods. So we see that while there is limited civil government, everything obviously belongs to God. He does have all authority. Jesus said in the Great Commission, all authority belongs to me. Another passage we see in how Jesus speaks to Pilate. He basically schools him on a biblical worldview of government. Pilate tells Jesus, "Don't you realize I have power over you?" And Jesus responds, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." There it is. Again, he's schooling Pilate on a biblical view of government. See, authority is not ultimately from Caesar. Authority comes from God. It's about authority. And that's what Jesus is pointing at. So this is some of his teachings that his disciples are to carry into all the world. And then there's the passage from Matthew 5:17 that we've already looked at. I did not come to abolish the law, Jesus said. By the way, as review, who inserted that Bible verse into his legal code? Who inserted that Bible verse? I'll switch my mic around there. King Arthur. You're close, Ben. King Alfred. Yeah, you got the A right. King Alfred, right? I mean, there's a lot of principles in the Bible that deal with civil government, and Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law. Okay? With King Alfred, and again, this is a little review from the DVD, but you've got Matthew 5 there. I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets until heaven and earth pass away, and obviously heaven and earth are still here. And then you've got Christ. Now this is actually in his legal code, in King Alfred's legal code. Christ came not these commands to break nor to forbid. Okay, there he's paraphrasing Matthew 5. But to spread them and teach. There he's paraphrasing the Great Commission. So as Alfred was applying this passage, what was he saying about God's civil laws outside of Israel? He was saying God's civil laws apply in principle even outside of Israel. I mean, because you've got passages like Psalm 2. All the kings have to submit to Jesus. You've got passages like, the king's heart can be directed by the Lord, and certainly that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. We see that God was in charge of him. We see what Jesus said to Pilate. The authority, the power comes from above, so it's authority. You've got the Matthew 5 passage. So you've got all these and other places in the Bible to see this, and this is the argument that King Alfred is making. For example, the DVD mentioned in Leviticus 20, where you see punishments for all kinds of crimes like adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, incest. I mean, some really disgusting stuff, right? But the punishment is death in Leviticus 20 for most of these things. But what's interesting is that God says, you better follow these laws or the land will vomit you out just like it did for the nations before you. You see this whole concept in both Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. Take a look. Leviticus 20. Keep all my decrees and laws and follow them so that the land where I am bringing you to live will not vomit you out. Leviticus 18. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws, and if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Wow, all this talk of vomiting. I certainly hope none of you are eating. Sorry about that if you are. But anyway, it's in the Bible. What can I say, Anyway, these passages speak to the fact that if Israel pollutes the land in the same way that the Canaanites polluted the land, then what will happen to them? They will be vomited out just like the Canaanites were. So the principle is this: you pollute the land spews you out. Well, how did the Canaanites pollute the land? Was it because they refused to recycle? Is that what it was? You guys aren't recycling, you're polluting the land, and so it's going to spew you out. No, that's not what it was. It was the fact as I think Hannah's pointing out too, that they were committing certain crimes, horrible crimes that were going unpunished, crimes like murder, rape, things like that. I mean, these are the types of crime that require the death penalty. Look again at Leviticus 20. Maybe look at it in your devotions. You know, you'll see a bunch of capital crimes listed. But here's the point. It wasn't only Israel that had to follow these civil laws. The Canaanites had to follow these laws, and because they didn't follow these laws, they polluted the land, and the land vomited them out. So that's why King Alfred is saying, hey, let's have these laws in England so we don't out, because it wasn't just Israel that had to follow the laws. The Canaanites had to follow the laws. They didn't follow the laws. They got spewed out. So Alfred is saying, we're going to follow these laws. And that's why King Alfred paraphrases Matthew 5:17 to say, hey, look, everybody, the principles behind Israel's laws are valid for us too. Again, in Leviticus 20, God says, if you don't obey these civil laws, these capital punishment laws, the land gets polluted and it will vomit you out. Well, how does the land spew you out? Can you think of examples from the Bible of how the land spews or vomits people out of the land? I'll give you a hint of a very famous story as one example of how the land vomited out its inhabitants. Anybody know what that story is? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? I mean, brimstone and fire. Hello, talk about being vomited out. Yeah, sunburn for sure. You know, you've got other examples outside of the Bible, like Pompeii. You know, it was just totally covered over. But it's not the only way that a country or a city gets vomited out. How did the land vomit out the Canaanites? It wasn't brimstone and fire. It was a conquering nation. Yeah, war. Very good. Attack. So that's one way God allows the land to vomit out its inhabitants. It's by being conquered or killed. You've also got, you know, natural disasters, even heavenly disasters. In fact, Sodom and Gomorrah could have been a heavenly disaster. There is evidence to suggest, you know, brimstone is what is that element? Oh man, I'm drawing a blank. But it's basically burning brick, but it's an element that you find sulfur. Thank you, sulfur, which you find in comets, and there is tremendous evidence that it was a comet as a result of a comet strike or asteroid or whatever you call it when it enters the atmosphere, that took out Sodom and Gomorrah. Don't have time to get into that. But anyway, you have natural disasters, you have diseases, war, many different ways that the land can vomit out its inhabitants. Well, the natural question then is, well, how do you prevent the land from vomiting out its inhabitants? Well, you need to cleanse the land so it doesn't vomit you out. See, there is a link between capital punishment and cleansing the land. Let's take a look at how this works. When God came to Cain after Cain killed Abel, what did God say to Cain, especially about his brother's blood? Clean it with bleach, yeah. Oh, if that's all it was, if that's all it took, right? But what did God say about Abel's blood? He said, Abel's blood is crying out to him from, finish the rest of it, from the ground. You see, the land had become polluted. Murder pollutes the land, Exodus 21:12. Rape pollutes the land, Deuteronomy 22. Several other crimes pollute the land. So, but here's the thing. Had God given the power of the sword yet? No. So Cain could not be punished. He was a wanderer. So eventually the land gets so polluted after all these murders and rapes and things like that. So what does God do? He floods the earth, right? God cleanses the land as the entire earth vomits out its inhabitants. But then you get to Genesis 9, post-flood. What happens in Genesis 9 for the first time in human history? The power of the sword is given to man to execute murderers. So capital punishment is now going to cleanse the land because the shedding the blood of a murderer cleanses the earth. Where do you see that? Well, you especially see this in the passage dealing with accidental killings. What's the penalty for an accidental killing? You know, somebody knocks a brick accidentally off a high ledge. It hits the worker below. It kills them. Wasn't done intentionally. What's the penalty? What's the penalty in the Old Testament? Run to the priest. You guys are getting close. Run away. There we go. City of refuge. Yes, city of refuge. And there is an aspect of the priest, because how long does the person have to stay at the city of refuge? Until the priest dies. Yes. This is a very, very important picture. The shedding of the high priest's blood cleanses the land, right? So why don't we have cities of refuge today? Why don't we have, exactly right. We don't have cities of refuge today because we have the final high priest who has shed his blood. You know, the Old Testament law regarding accidental killings was a ceremonial law. That's why we never had them in this country. Even the Pilgrims and the Puritans, which were very strict according to applying biblical law, they never had cities of refuge for accidental killings because Jesus' blood cleanses the land for those type of killings, the accidental ones. But let me ask you this, is this only for accidental killings? How would you answer the question if somebody asks you, well, hey, if Jesus' death on the cross cleanses the land of killings, then there should be no more capital punishment at all. His blood cleanses the land for all murders, all killings, forever. How would you answer that? No, not just accidental killings, all murders. No more capital punishment. How would you answer that question? Would you say, oh, good point. Gee, Mr. Pratt never talked about that. Romans 13. Okay, that's a great place to start, Christina, that, you know, if civil government can't do that, then what is this power of the sword that Romans 13 talks about? Please explain. Because, you know, contextually, the power of the sword is the power to put people to death. So that's a good part of the answer. But you can also go back even further, because even in the Old Testament, just to be consistent, the shedding of the high priest's blood did not mean that murderers could go free or that rapists could go free. It never meant that. It only meant that accidental killers could go free. Okay, so do you see that distinction? I mean, that distinction is really important. The reason Jesus' death on the cross doesn't excuse murderers is because the high priest's blood being shed never excused murderers or set them free. Now, just to be clear, Jesus' death on the cross does mean that even a murderer doesn't have to suffer for all eternity. Now, that is true. So even though they may face temporary consequences, they don't have to suffer eternally. Okay, so that, you know, Jesus' death is very important in terms of that. So you cleanse the land with capital punishment for certain crimes, but obviously not every crime deserves capital punishment. So how then do you know which crimes should be punished by death and which ones shouldn't be? Again, it comes back, as always, to our worldview. will God's principles decide, or do we decide? You know, if you took a poll of Americans, I would think most people, if they believe in capital punishment, would probably not have a problem with executing murderers, certainly if they believe in capital punishment, maybe rape. But even then, I think most people today who support capital punishment don't believe in it for rape. I don't think there's anywhere in the country that still punishes rape with death. We used to in this country, but not anymore. So again, how do we know that's right? How do we determine how certain crimes should be punished? Well, as some of you are saying, you know, we take it back to the Bible. God's word decides. You know, take the question, what about an out-of-control, rebellious, and violent teenager? I mean, that sounds pretty radical to even ask about that, right? But the Puritans had a law that could punish such teenagers with death. Were they just crazy? Well, you saw in the DVD that Jesus actually addressed this punishment. I mean, most American Christians today, even, well, especially non-Christians, but even some Christians would probably look at that and say, wow, that is a harsh God. That doesn't sound very just to me. And so the question you have to ask, you know, Jesus dealt with this question, this crime. Did Jesus think that God's civil laws and punishments were too harsh and unjust? Oh my, that's nasty. Just read James's comment. You know, what's interesting is God's law never had the like chopping off of hands or crushing of the jewels, as it were. That tends to be more pagan law or Muslim law. Where did Jesus? Well, this was in the DVD. Let me bring up the passage there. It blew you away when you listen to this, because the Pharisees are taking Jesus' disciples to task. Okay? Look at the passage and tell me, hopefully it jogs your memory, what were the Pharisees chastising Jesus for? What were the Pharisees taking him to task for? Washing of hands, or the fact that his disciples were not washing their hands. Was that a biblical command? I mean, you might think it is, because haven't you grown up all your life? Wash your hands before you eat. It's a good rule, certainly a good tradition, but that's all it was. It was a tradition of the elders. So Jesus fires right back, and he rebukes them for setting aside God's commands for their own traditions. In other words, they're criticizing Jesus for breaking a tradition. Jesus points out, well, you're breaking God's laws. And in fact, you set up traditions in order to break God's laws. You know, notice this. Jesus never criticizes the Pharisees for being too careful to follow God's law. I know sometimes we almost think that that's what he's doing, but he doesn't. He either rebukes them for ignoring God's laws to follow traditions, like he does in this passage, or in other passages he rebukes them for following easy laws and ignoring the weightier laws, okay? Or he rebukes them for trying to use the law to gain salvation, what we would call legalism, right? But Jesus always upheld the law and spoke well of it. I mean, remember Matthew 5? I didn't come to abolish the law. He never rebukes them for following the law. He rebukes them for twisting the law and missing the meaning of the law. You know, now looking at this passage here, what is the moral law that Jesus rebukes them for violating? What is God's law that they're not following? What is it? One of the 10 Commandments. Give you a huge hint there. Honor your father and your mother, right? And he's pointing out to them, you're not taking care of your parents. By the way, I just want to emphasize this. You kids have a duty, according to honor your father and your mother, and as explained or expounded by Jesus in this passage, you have a duty to provide for your parents in your old age, in their old age. Sorry. And he's rebuking the Pharisees for not providing for their parents. You see Jesus doing that, by the way, when he's on the cross, right? He has John take care of his mom. So taking care of your parents is something that is really, really important. If there's any parents listening in right now, you have my permission to take this and use it and remind your child of it frequently and continuously until your dying day. So, but this is important. I mean, God takes this seriously. Now, that's the moral law that they're violating. Tell me, look at this passage and tell me, what is the civil law that Jesus rebukes them for ignoring? In other words, by civil law is government law. If you don't do this, then government can punish you. In other words, we call that crimes. What is the crime that they're committing and that they're ignoring? They're not even enforcing. Jesus quotes it, and it's part of the rebuke to them because they're not following this. Cursing their parents, which results in death. How can Jesus bring up this passage? I mean, isn't this passage like crazy, ridiculous, like harsh, unjust? Any clue that Jesus thought this law was too harsh or that they shouldn't worry about following it? Any clue that Jesus is embarrassed by this passage? No, we might be as 21st century Americans. Jesus was not. He throws this in their face and says this is one of God's laws that you're ignoring for your traditions. Now, just to be clear, God's law showed that the civil law dealing with the execution of rebellious kids involved much more than just punishing little Johnny when he's in his terrible twos, right? I mean, this Deuteronomy passage that you see on the screen is talking about a drunkard, and he's become dangerous because he will not listen when he's disciplined. Look, even the most defiant, terrible two will obey when you spank his bottom, right? In the DVD, I read the story about the Christian cop, Robert Surgener, who described a teenager who busted a ceramic lamp over his mother's head, hit his father with a fire poker, threw a coffee table through the front window, and wrestled with 5 policemen before he was finally subdued in handcuffs. I mean, that's the kind of kid's almost the wrong word to use, juvenile, young adult that Deuteronomy is talking about. But even then, under God's law, could Jewish parents just haul off and kill the kid? Like, just take Johnny in the backyard and put him out of our misery. No, right? Because there's due process. There's a trial. The parents take him to the city officials, the elders. There's a trial held, and this is outside of the parents doing. It's a civil crime, so it's dealt with civilly. It's not parent it's not enforced by the parents. They're just simply the witnesses to the crime that's being committed. Now, it's still a hard passage, but when you actually look at it, it's maybe not as, like, what, little Johnny? 2-year-old Johnny? No, it's definitely not that. So does that make sense? I mean, you see that? You see how Jesus, oh my goodness, does not shrink back at all at applying God's law or even God's civil law. It doesn't shrink back at all. Okay, any questions? Let's just wrap this up since we got only 2 minutes left. Let's wrap this up and review. We looked at, again, the biblical foundations of God's law. In the Old Testament, did the principles of God's civil laws, that's government laws establishing crimes, did the principles for God's civil laws apply outside of Israel? Yeah, they did. And we went through the passages, Psalm 2, the ones in Leviticus where, the Canaanites were, kicked out of the land because they didn't follow it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. What was King Alfred's point about God's civil laws from Matthew chapter 5? His point was God's civil laws, hey, they're going to apply in England. So that's why he quotes Matthew 5. And by the way, this is the common law tradition that came to the United States. Why even secular, non-Christian legal scholars look at the common law and say, wow, it's very Christian in nature. It's because of King Alfred. Thank you, King Alfred. And again, to ask the obvious question, was there any indication that Jesus thought God's laws or his civil laws were too harsh, or like, that's kind of like Old Testament stuff, guys, don't worry about that? No, there's none of that. I mean, he'd be arguing against himself because he gave those laws, right? I mean, Jesus is part of the Trinity. So, using God's laws, we began looking at the War for Independence. As I said earlier, we're not done with this subject. What we saw today was that the founders tried to consciously tie their actions to God's word. Okay? They wanted to make sure that what they were doing was right. So they appealed to the supreme judge of the world, as they said, for the rectitude of our intentions. And let's face it, as we looked at Samuel Rutherford and the life of David, their actions were consistent with David's life and the writings of Samuel Rutherford, who obviously had a great hairdo back in the day, right? It's probably a wig. Anyway, we also, of course, looked at the laws of nature and nature's God, the code word for God's laws in the 18th century, laws of nature, laws of God. Again, that's a term that was used in church. It was used in politics. It's just how they spoke. It was not a deistic concept, which is how some people look at it today. But that's because we're not familiar with the phrase laws of nature, laws of nature's God. But that is how they spoke even in the church back in the day. All right, we're at 9:30 Eastern Time, which means we must wrap it up here and see if there's any questions. Here's your assignments again. Any questions about what we've gone over? Did I miss any questions? I had a question. Yeah, sure. All right, let's get Hannah on. Hang on. There we go. Hey, Hannah, how you doing?
Good. Can you hear me?
Yes. What's your question?
Okay. Sorry, this is kind of about something we talked about in the beginning of class, but I have a few friends that say, like, oh, we can, let's say, cross at a red light, so like jaywalk, because even though the law says not to do it, we're obeying the heart of the law, which is just to make sure that we're safe and we don't die or get run over by a car. So we're obeying the heart of the law, not the letter of the law, so it's okay. And I don't know exactly what to say about that, so I didn't know what you thought.
Okay. Anybody have thoughts on that? Obeying the heart of the law and not the letter of the law? I guess you bring up a hard one because, Hannah, I have jaywalked in my lifetime from time to time. So let me just say for up front, I am guilty as charged. But I guess the problem with that is what happens when obeying the heart of the law conflicts with the letter of the law. Then you are a lawbreaker, right? Now, there can be situations, like let's say you jaywalk in order to run out into the street and rescue a child who had tripped and couldn't get up and the car is coming. I think that would be a good example of how Jesus applied the law. Like, for example, Jesus never said don't obey the Sabbath, but he did say you can do acts of mercy that will actually violate the way the Pharisees had interpreted the Sabbath. So he says, you guys, if an ox falls into a ditch, you don't wait till the next day. You go rescue it. Well, that's work. And he said the priests also, in a sense, violate the Sabbath doing work, doing their work. So, there are those examples where in order to show mercy and love, you've got, which really trumps everything. I mean, because that is, all Jesus said, all the law